Tell me a little bit about yourself and your background in IoT.
Sure. So I'm Mark Stanislav. I'm a senior security consultant with Rapid7, which is a security products and services company based out of Boston. And Internet of Things for me is really more focused on security research. So I've had numerous devices that I've actually reviewed, looked how they're built, understood what components were secure, which ones were insecure, and then working with vendors to make the products more safe for consumers and businesses.
So what type of products are you mostly working with?
All kinds of things. Cameras is a specific area that I spend a lot of time in. Yeah. So web cameras have gone a long ways since we all had VGA 640 by 480 type poor video, terrible audio. We have web cameras now that have full high def, fisheye lenses, great audio fidelity, and people are putting 2 and 3 of these in their home at a time. So I think there's a lot of privacy concerns, obviously, safety concerns. The possibility that someone could break into your camera online, know when you're home or not, know who's there. That's pretty disconcerting, I think, for most people. And whether you're a business or a homeowner, that's the kind of thing that you want to know if that camera is going to be a threat to your home, or is that a value to your safety.
Now, what would you say? I mean, obviously your sample size isn't going to be that high, but what would you say from 1 to 10 where the industry is today? Let's just use cameras for that matter. From a security point of view, where do you think we're at?
Cameras is not. I would say cameras is not an area that most people would want to use as a litmus test for what security should look like. Unfortunately, even though web cameras in general have been around for quite a while, the IoT cameras that we're seeing on the market currently, numerous security issues, privacy issues, hard-coded credentials that you can log in if you know them, no matter who you are. And actually, the first case the FTC brought against a company kind of in the IoT space was the company TrendNet. And so TrendNet actually had a complaint rendered against them by the FTC, a whole bunch of kind of forced hand for 20 years of a security program they have to kind of develop and maintain, biannual security audits that they're required to have happen. And this is all because they had a certain version of their firmware that came out on some of their cameras, and someone posted the credentials to those, or I should say a link to those cameras, and about 500 cameras were publicly known within about a day. Wow. And you would look inside someone's home and there was nothing to stop you. So
what's the rating?
About a 3.
Oh man, I was hoping you
about
were
a 3. There's definitely better people in the market, companies that are security focused.
Yeah.
The company Dropcam that was acquired by Nest, who is owned by Google. Dropcam has a great security reputation. It was built by people that understood security and really built with the intention to not be another bad camera company in the IoT space.
Right, so that's good. That's something to aspire to, be not a bad company in the IoT space.
It should be easier than it is, but unfortunately, a lot of companies just don't understand security that well. It's not, no company's trying to make a bad product. No company's trying to be insecure or put their consumers at risk. That I don't see that happening.
Of course not.
But unfortunately, if you don't understand security well enough and you build a product, bad things are probably going to happen.
And what about the consumer electronics market as a whole? What would you rate it then?
I would say overall it's not as bad. I would say probably closer to maybe let's say a 5 or a 6. Again, for
passing now.
IoT specifically, in a lot of ways, we're in the nascency of IoT.
Right.
People are figuring out what it means. We don't have standardized firmwares. We don't have standardized network protocols, wireless protocols. Mobile apps and APIs are all very different.
Right.
And so while the industry is kind of shifting around and kind of feeling what feels right and what seems secure, a lot of people are going to be testing. And whenever you test, unfortunately, if you're testing with actual products on a market, unfortunately things will happen, and we'll learn from them, and the industry will mature, and in 5 years we'll have probably a much better score than we have now.
Yeah, and that's right. Early on, there's not as many devices. We don't have those trillion, devices out there yet. So it's going to take a little bit of time to get there, and by then, hopefully, the security will be a lot stronger. Well, let's move into what do you consider the top 3 IoT security issues in consumer IoT?
Yeah, so one major one is really just the network security, the transport security. Okay. So let's say you're transmitting video and audio from someone's home web camera. Many of these devices will transmit that video and audio to a mobile application. So if you're at Starbucks with me and you pull out your phone and you start watching your camera at home and seeing what's going on, or maybe you have a baby monitor that you're watching, see how your kid's doing. If that network transport isn't secure, if I'm at Starbucks with you, I can sniff that Wi-Fi connection and I can watch the exact same stream of your home, hear what's happening in your home. And then also things like credentials could be stolen that way as well.
Right.
So that's one thing that unfortunately is not done very well in consumer IoT.
Okay.
A lot of people are not encrypting connections.
I was going to say, wouldn't this all be encrypted anyway?
You would believe that, but when you start diving into the mobile applications, the software that runs in the actual device, quite often they're actually not encrypted.
And is that just a cost issue? I mean, computationally, it should be able to do the encryption, right?
So that, I'm actually glad that you brought that up. And, from your programming background, I think that comes from an honest place, because developers at this point, with some of the chipsets even 2 or 3 years ago, they didn't have the power in a lot of these IoT devices to actually do some of the, RSA standards and AES standards and some of the other cryptography standards that we trust in. Even things like generating the keys. So the actual cryptographic keys you need to have on the device. One of the vendors I used to work with, it took them about 15 minutes on the device hardware they were using to generate the keys strong enough. And they were like, we can't give that to a consumer. We can't expect them to wait 15 minutes the first time they use it. So they made trade-offs, and the trade-offs, unfortunately, were for security, and convenience took over.
Now, what about today? Are the chipsets there
now? The things we're seeing come onto the market, there's a great company called Pinocchio, system on chip provider based out of Ann Arbor, Michigan, with an office out here in the Bay Area.
Okay.
And they have a lot of power on their device, very small, very useful. But we've look at things like Intel's Edison chip platform.
Okay.
Again, very powerful. But 2 to 3 years, and just the scale of computing in general, that's a big deal. 2 to 3 years is like a generation in IoT computing.
So we're getting there.
Absolutely, we are getting there. But keep in mind manufacturing costs.
Yeah.
If you're a small IoT startup or you're a crowdfunded organization, you might not spend the extra $2 per chip to get the one that can do the cryptography.
Right.
When you're just like anyone else in business, you're looking at margin, and you're trying to make it with a product that you don't know if it's going to be successful, keep costs low, and sometimes skimp on some of the benefits of security.
Number 2.
So number 2, APIs. There, again, not a lot of standardization around the APIs that people use, whether that's to transmit data from the IoT device to somewhere in the cloud.
Okay.
That could be an API to control the actual device over the internet. So let's say I want to rotate my camera left and right and pan and tilt and zoom and all that. A lot of that's going to be an API call over a web connection. And quite often those don't have authentication tied into them.
Is it because they're proprietary, or why?
In a lot of cases, developers, I don't think, fully grasp that just because you're not telling someone how to make a connection, it's something that someone won't see how to make the connection. So as a researcher, I can do network analysis. I can look at the protocols. I can reverse engineer the commands you're sending. And I can understand things that you never intended for any consumer to be able to see. But when you're talking about security, if the bad guy can see it on a network like at a Starbucks, all hope is lost. Like, you have to have authentication, and a lot of organizations just don't think that far through the problem.
Okay.
They're not threat modeling for a person on your home Wi-Fi network or your apartment Wi-Fi network being a bad guy. They're thinking, they're only thinking about the big internet and what that would look like, and not enough about the local networks that we all use every day.
Right. Number 3.
So number 3 is actually the data. So the data at rest. If I transmit video and audio, how are you storing that?
Okay.
Are you encrypting it on the device and then sending it to the cloud? When it gets to the cloud, is it encrypted?
Okay.
Is the data accessible if I know a certain URL? Do I have to type in a username and password or pass an API token? And what I see a lot in the research I do is, unfortunately, in many cases, the data isn't stored encrypted at all. It's sent often not even encrypted over the internet when it gets to where it has to go.
Okay.
And then if again, if you're on the local network and can see a connection, quite often, if I know your user ID even, and sometimes the user ID is like user ID 1, 2, 3, and it's just sequential. And if you know your user ID, you flip the bit and you now have a new user ID, and now you have access to someone's data.
Wow.
And even another good example, especially in cloud, we have a lot of shared storage, right? So like in Amazon Web Services, you make a bucket for data, and a lot of times the vendors aren't actually segmenting that data from customer A to customer B.
Really?
So if I can log in as customer A with an API key, they're not thinking far enough ahead that maybe someone else would try to look for someone else's data on that same server.
Wow.
So a lot of...
So cross boundaries?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So, what is the most popular? I think I read this a little while ago, but what's the most popular password in consumers? Isn't it like 123 or something? I can't.
Oh
remember.
yeah, users have always made really bad passwords. It's no surprise. 123, 12345, password as the password.
Password, yeah.
But unfortunately, vendors aren't much better. Vendors.
Default, you mean like the default
exactly.
password? It's not changed.
Exactly, and a lot of cases, and one of the things I think frustrates me the most as a security professional is the vendor could require that the consumer change the password as soon as they boot that device up the first time, but almost always they don't. There's very few vendors that actually enforce the.
Why do you think that is?
It's one of the life's great mysteries because it's such a simple
they don't
step.
Offend the consumer, the buyer.
It's another step to frustrate the consumer. Another 30 hours of support calls that they have to pay someone to handle.
Yeah, now I think you're getting at it a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. All right, let's switch gears.
Sure.
Let's move into the commercial IoT space, and what do you consider the top 3 IoT security threats there?
Yeah, so in commercial space, if we're thinking about industrial or manufacturing, businesses in let's say a hotel chain doing kind of IoT, wireless signals, a lot of wireless, Zigbee being one, Wi-Fi of course being one, Bluetooth Low Energy is very hot right now, and something we see just about in every new device.
Sure. Yeah.
Someone once kind of made the analogy that Bluetooth is like bacon; everything's better with it. So we seem to just add Bluetooth into anything, whether or not it needs it.
Right. Okay.
And so the more of those wireless protocols you add, and when you're looking at commercial implications, if I can control a motor through a unauthenticated Bluetooth signal, or I can turn off a machine because it's connected with Zigbee, for instance, which is very popular in those kind of applications.
Sure.
If I'm near the building, I might be able to send a command, and no one will actually check whether or not I was the intended party to send that command or not.
But what's the issue? You're saying, is it because there's too many radios and they're not thinking about securing all of them? Is that the issue, or is it something different?
Part of it, kind of getting back to threat models.
Yeah.
Organizations think, we have this network that is only meant to be within our business.
Okay.
And who would ever do a bad thing physically to us? They're not thinking of the physical threat of an attacker who drives by a commercial or industrial park and starts sniffing the air by them and doing bad things. And that could be a prank, whether or not people think that happens. But the whole Wi-Fi hacking that happened from really 2001 until just even a few years ago, this idea of war driving, where people would get in a car, pull their laptop out with a friend, and just find wireless networks and hop on them and see what computers were there and break into them, even with encryption. And the same thing can happen very easily with all these other protocols.
Okay.
So it's.
But how do you protect against that then?
Well, a couple of things. So one, some of these protocols aren't actually being encrypted in the first place.
Right.
So like a Wi-Fi network, should use WPA2. That's kind of the
Makes sense.
golden standard these days.
Yeah.
Long passphrase is not the address of the building you're in right now, which I've actually seen in actual real life happen. So those kinds of scenarios, but then also if you're developing with the protocol, something like Bluetooth, for instance, we've seen a couple devices. I think the Nike Fuel Band, where I'm pivoting slightly to consumer, but the Nike wearable actually had a default pin on every device. And if you knew that default pin, which was pretty easy to retrieve, you could connect to anyone's device and so the same thing happens in industrial commercial. You have a Bluetooth signal and it has a default pin, and if you know that pin, you can control every device that manufacturer ever made.
Number 2.
So number 2, cryptography is a big thing in manufacturing, industrial, and why is because the oftentimes the cryptography is built in, and we see a lot of shared keys. So a manufacturer builds a product. And they put it through their development cycle, and they generate one cryptography key, and that goes on every single device they'll ever make. So in a commercial space, if I install that motor and I'm sending traffic over the internet, I as an attacker, let's say nation state China wants to break into something, and they find out this little bit of information, they can now decrypt all the traffic going from that commercial device over the internet to a third party. Let's say maybe you have a business to business scenario and you're transmitting production data. If it's coming directly from one of these IoT manufacturing devices, you might actually be able to see all that traffic as if it had been in the clear all the time.
With a single key.
One,
just a single key.
exactly, and we see this in a lot of different ways. Credentials is another. Going back to vendors.
Yeah.
Vendors don't. They quite often have kind of the magic backdoor, right? You have a hard-coded credential. They don't often publish them to consumers or to manufacturers.
But they're there.
But you can go online and search for default password list, and you can find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of default passwords for devices that you never knew even had one.
And if the owner did not change it, then they can access.
Well, and the scary thing is, we've seen this happen a lot, especially lately. And I think D-Link had a router, and Asus also had a router, where they had two different ways, but they had backdoors. There weren't credentials you could change. There was an IP camera that I did research on that had a default username and a default password on every single camera they ever made, and there was no way for the consumer to change it.
All right, number 3.
So when I'm saying a 3 for camera security, this is where this comes from. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. So number 3, I could go a couple of different ways with number 3. The one concern I have is the physical access, though. When you have
a lot of people don't talk about that.
When you have, especially again, industrial, SCADA, ICS type applications, and maybe there's a USB port somewhere. Maybe there's a very shallow 2-screwed panel on this device that now exposes headers that if I have a certain tool, I can plug in 2 or 3 wires and actually get full administrative console access to that hardware.
Right.
Embedded device security is certainly one avenue for security researchers like myself to go after. I can get the firmware directly off the device.
Right.
I can interact with the device as if I have full administrative privilege. A lot of interesting things you can do. In the consumer context, though, that's not too scary. Most people aren't going to go in your home and plug something into your camera.
Yeah,
but when you have industrial deployments, you have a lot of
maybe
third parties.
Or something
Exactly. You have contractors. You have traffic sensors is a interesting research. A company called IOActive in the security research space did a lot of review of traffic sensors, and they weren't manipulating the traffic control system.
But the sensor.
They were manipulating the sensor, and the sensor then would manipulate the traffic control system. And so when you have the data inputs, you're making a trust chain there, and you might not defend against one thing and over-defend another thing, but really it's locking the front door, leaving the back door open, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly that scenario. So when we look at physical access, how much of the actual processing of what's going on could be directly touched by someone that you don't have a trust in, or they're a third-party contractor that came on site.
Right.
That's a big risk for industrial and manufacturing.
So it seems like 2 themes that are coming out here, the same themes, from my background in more, the bigger iron networking, but user error, it's just like not changing things, and then it seems like the manufacturers are taking shortcuts when the technology's there, they're just not utilizing it. So do you think the technology is there? I know nothing is completely safe.
Sure.
But is the technology there within a reasonable amount of money and effort to make a safe Internet of Things, both on the industrial side and on the consumer side?
Absolutely. I think the trick right now is because we don't have a lot of standards, and because people are kind of feeling their way through the forest, we don't have that list of best practices, or at least it's not as well known as it should be, unfortunately, to companies, and they're kind of inventing their own roads.
Right.
And
Dangerous.
so we're feeling the pain of people trying to be creative, perhaps in areas that they're not qualified to be creative in. And that's why I think another 5 years, some of the bigger players make some great standards. People start replicating best practices versus making their own stuff up.
Okay.
And we start seeing maturity, and that maturity is going to beget better security for everyone.
Okay, so you think yes? I mean, you think it's
Yeah, the technology. We have cryptography standards. We have network protocols that work. We have we know what passwords look like and how to make them better. It's all kind of known quantities. We just have to figure out how to put them in the right order, and put them in the right order with the right security in the right places. Again, people might put too much security in the wrong place, and not enough security in a place they don't think is important, but actually is crucial.
Okay, so you need to think it through 360 degrees. All right, Mark. Well, that's been very interesting. Can you tell our viewers where they can find more about you and the work that you're doing?
Sure. So the company I work for is Rapid7, so that's just rapid7.com. And the initiative I had actually co-founded for IoT security is called Build It Securely. So the website's just builditsecure.ly.
Okay.
And what we do is we have security researchers that we pair up with IoT vendors.
Okay.
And the goal is to bring better, safer products to the market. So we actually work with these vendors, hopefully, before they launch their product. And so by the time they go to market, the first thing that a consumer or a business does when they get it isn't immediately upgrade it for security issues.
Okay.
We want to make a better experience. We think there's a lot of value in IoT, and we're trying to help, in a pro bono way to help out the community and make sure that people get safer things that they put online and put in their homes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.